Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the Senior Management and Certification Regime, hosted by Fieldfisher and Complyport. My name is Jonathan Greenstein. I'm joined today by David Palmer, Senior Associate, Employment, Pensions, Immigration and Compliance within Fieldfisher, and Robert Irvine, Senior Consultant from Complyport. A quick bit of housekeeping. On your screen, you should see some buttons towards the bottom of the screen that allow you to submit questions, titled Q&A. Please do so as and when you have one. We'll save all questions and answer them after the formal presentation. In today's webinar, we hope to look at some of the common issues both our firms have seen regarding the implementation of the SMCR. In the webinar, we will look at common issues pre and post 9th of December 2019. These will include looking at documentation processes, employee contracts, training, the FCA register, the directory, annual reviews, new hires, Gable returns, and more. I'd now like to quickly let our two presenters introduce themselves.
Hi everybody, I'm David Palmer. I'm a Senior Associate at Fieldfisher. I work in the employment team here, as Jonathan said, and my area of expertise is the financial services sector. So I've been helping clients deal with the people aspects of the implementation of the senior managers regime, and I was around at the time when that regime was also rolled out to the banks. So I have got some years of experience with dealing with the issues that arise.
Brilliant, thank you very much, David. And Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Irvine. I'm Senior Consultant at Complyport. I work my work is day-to-day directly with a variety of financial services clients, and I'm on the SM&CR implementation team, so I've been looking at the drafting and documentation and how the regime is actually going to be implemented by our firms and our clients.
Brilliant. So David, Robert, thank you for the introductions. Let's look by starting at the issues pre-9th of December, and over to you, Robert.
Okay, so firstly we have the SMCR, and it's called a new dawn of individual responsibility, called it here, because whenever we get a new piece of legislation like this, we look at the first simple question, which is what is the FCA actually attempting to do? What are they trying to get to happen? What's their outcome? So SMCR aims to increase accountability of individuals, of the individuals running firms and those within firms. It also increases the accountability of the firms for the actions taken by them and their employees. So firms.
Sorry,
I think we skipped ahead.
For some reason, the computer doesn't like me for everything with 2 seconds, please.
Okay. So the FCA have made it very clear that firms need to get the SMCR right first time. This is because the regulatory regime already exists for banks. Personally, I think this is not a brilliant argument, because if you think about how a bank is actually structured, they are, or a big insurer, they tend to be structured in similar, although not identical ways, whereas actually what the FCA is rolling out here is a regime that could be for 2 people, 20 people or 200 people. So size of firms and differences in firms haven't necessarily been taken into account as well as they might, and I think that's what's raising a lot of the issues and the questions we're getting on this. So as the FCA is implementing a new regime, what they tend to do is request additional information once that regime is in place. So they want to make sure that it's been properly implemented by firms and check the effectiveness of the rules. So what we're expecting is that in the next couple of years, maybe straight away, the FCA will send out questionnaires and potentially ask for documentation to see how firms have actually implemented the SM&CR and how well firms are responding to this change in regulatory landscape. When they rolled this out for the banks, and as they've done a few times before, they've sort of done a staged review of how well firms are prepared. And I think we're thinking this may happen again with SM&CR. So we think it's going to be a more proactive approach from the FCA once the new regime comes in to check that firms have done what the FCA expects them to. The other and potentially most likely outcome is enforcement action. So the FCA are trying to change the way firms think and how individuals act and change what the new normal is, as it were. So one of the ways they'll change this is they'll enforce actions against firms to make sure that firms are doing what they are expected to do. Okay, so documenting the process. So the first thing that hopefully, I'll say at this point that we would generally expect firms by now to be getting the documentation in place, hopefully to have the documentation done and be looking at those slightly more implementation areas. So we're almost, hopefully, looking back in time. So looking at documenting processes, the first thing you need to do is really get that board buy-in. Senior management and board need to be aware that they will be liable from day one. So once they're aware of that, hopefully, you get them on board, and once they come on board, then the drafting of the documentation and getting the regime actually in place becomes easier. And we found that the firms who managed to get the senior people on board most effectively are finding implementation of the regime easiest. We won't say easy because that isn't always the way, but they're finding it easier to get this going because they have engaged the board from an early point in time. So there is also, because we're now moving to more individual accountability, there is professional indemnity and legal insurance should probably be considered, because if there are actions that happen, you want to make sure that you don't have to spend, as a director, you don't have to spend all your personal money defending your personal liability. So those are all worth checking. The other thing we found that's been quite interesting is where the lead on SM&CR actually comes from, HR or compliance. So bigger firms, it generally sits in HR. It doesn't always sit in HR. It's a sort of resource battle with some of these things where you've got a big compliance operation and a small HR operation. We're tending to find it sits in HR, in compliance, but where firm has quite a reasonably sized HR operation, it seems to fit more naturally that HR will, in general, run the process with sign-on and sign-off from compliance. And the next thing we're thinking about is getting that documentation actually in place. So there's sort of three main elements to this. Firstly, updating the current documentation people have. So certainly CISC policies, manuals, organisational charts will need to be updated because they will tend to refer to the old regime, particularly the manual tends to describe the old regime and how that's working, and what the manual needs to do is describe the new regime and how that's going to work. Also, updating employment contracts, which is a probable necessary, I would say.
Yeah, it's definitely desirable. Obviously, there's no issue with updating template employment contracts because nobody's this your template. The kind of things I'd be talking about adding to those documents would be things like the employee agreeing to comply with annual self-attestation, that they're fit and proper, that they'll cooperate with any the annual process, that they will make sure they do a good handover. Obviously, you want to spell out that if they breach the conduct rules, that can amount to gross misconduct. All those kind of good things. And what I've seen as a quite common approach in practice is that there'll be three types of contract or types of clause that you would add, which one for senior managers, one for certification staff, and one just for people covered by the conduct rules. Obviously, for employees that are currently under an employment contract, then the ideal situation is that you get them to agree to the new term. So those are the kind of things that we've been doing.
And finally, new templates. So obviously, statements of responsibility are going to be the big one, and regulatory references are the other things that firms are looking at. We'll probably come on to those 2 points in more detail, but we Complyport have developed a list of documentation we'd expect to see, and we're finding that I think when you get a new piece of legislation and suddenly you're asked to provide a template for a statement of responsibility, the obvious question is, what does that look like and what should that look like? And a lot of firms who are coming to us, we're finding that their first question is, well, what do the templates look like? What do I need to have in all of these new documents? And obviously that's where we assist, because the relatively well defined by the FCA to actually find those bits of information that explain how things are. Right, so checking the register. So just finally on that, so if you're still in the earlier phases of the regime, there is still time, but we would suggest that you get on with it, quite frankly, because it's not a deadline that we want anyone to miss, because missing it would seem to have quite severe regulatory consequences, or at least potentially severe regulatory consequences. So again, we say here firms will already have decided who their senior managers are and how they will be grandfathered to the new regime. So this is discussing the senior managers aspects of the regime. So obviously within the senior managers regime we have senior managers certification and the conduct rules staff. So there's almost 3 bits of the regime. I think one of the things that's been missed quite a few times is those looking at actually there's 3 bits to this regime. There isn't just one. We tend to call it the senior managers regime, but we neglect the certification and conduct elements. So firms have already decided who their senior managers functions are. Most of them should be grandfathered over relatively easily. I think, have you mentioned our project plan?
So I was going to come to that later.
So we have a project plan, and one of the things right at the front of that project plan is a table of individuals who are currently senior managers or currently certified, and then looking at how they will grandfather across. And the grandfathering across is generally quite simple. So you write down all of your certification stuff, and then you just look at how the FCA would move them across and whether that would end up being right. And if not, there are actions to take. So once that new regime comes in, the FCA register will obviously be updated, and we would expect firms to do a special check on the FCA register, because as the FCA constantly reminds us, it is up to firms to make sure the register is accurate, even if the FCA don't necessarily do what they should do. So Form Ks and Form As. So NEDs and chairs who are executive chairs. So the regime takes most of the non-executive directors' functions out of the senior managers regime, and they become conduct staff. So that's also been has had some confusion for firms, because suddenly you're going from being authorised by the FCA and seemingly then dropping out almost entirely from regulatory requirements, although the FCA have pointed out on a number of occasions that you're still a conduct rules employee, so the conduct rules still apply, and you still have those specific requirements that go along with being an ed. So the form, if your chair is a non-executive director, then you will need to submit before 9th of December a Form K, which will move that chair into the SMF9 function, and all other NEDs become conduct staff. Now that documents, the Form K seems to request a list of who your other non-executive directors are, and therefore you would just list them. However, if you have a chair who is an executive chair, you will need a Form A, because technically you'll be applying for a new function as a Form A. So you'll be applying for someone to have a new function, even if they've been doing this function for 10 years. Technically, it's a new senior management function. So in that case, you need to do a Form A. And we've started doing this with a few of our firms. And there are some questions that didn't used to be in the application form, but are now in the application forms. So there's sort of general questions about why you've hired the individual, which are fine, and then some supporting documentation, which firms who are coming into the core regime won't have had to deal with before under Form A. So the first one is a skills gap analysis. So we're looking at what the individual who is going to be becoming the SMF9 or the new senior management function, it's for a different one, what they need, where their skills gap is, what do they need support with. Then the FCA asked about the induction program for that individual and a learning and development plan. And also a competency assessment, although if they weren't competent, you shouldn't be getting authorised. But the FCA is expecting more information on these Form A. So actually, when firms are looking at moving someone to an exec chair, particularly using going to an SMF9, we suggest you give yourself enough time to look at these new requirements. Obviously, some of these don't quite make sense if you have a chair who's been around for 10 years. Obviously they won't have an induction program necessarily. They've already been the chair. It's just a thing. But once the rest of the Form A's come in, then they will be required. So CS30 is falling off the register. This creates a bit of a regulatory gap for this 1 year, where we're going to have CS30s will move into the certification regime, and so that means firms are required to certify individuals who have previously been certified by the FCA. And the question then arises, we're going to have a year with effectively a regulatory gap and an information gap for clients. While probably less of an issue for ongoing clients, who will probably have a contact at the firm who they talk to relatively regularly, who can be communicated to relatively easily. If you've got new clients or you're dealing with retail clients, I think the FCA has slightly expects that retail people go on the register and check that someone is authorised by the firm, and I'm sure some of them do, but probably not to the extent that we in the industry think they're going to. But how do you as a firm show who your CF30, who your certified staff are? So it might be that you have something on your website which almost lists them, but is there an issue with doing that? Maybe you ask individuals to email the compliance officer, who obviously will be listed, and they will be able to say, yes, this person is authorised, yes, this person can talk to you, or whatever, or even or a letter to clients maybe saying these are our certified employees, but then if that changes, what do you do? So it's a bit of a thing we're struggling with, and as I say, it's more looking at how new clients would come across the business and how they might try and interact with you in a relatively short space of time, where previously they would have just gone on the register and gone, great, they're a CS30, I can talk to them. Now that becomes more difficult, and we're trying to implement this as smoothly as possible for firms and for clients of firms. So once, obviously this is only a problem for a year, because once the directory comes in, certified employees will go on the directory and it will cease to be an issue. And yeah, it's a bit of a think piece, that, unfortunately, rather than lots of brilliant solutions, but it is something that a few of our firms are beginning to think about. Staff training. So the levels of training required for senior managers and conduct rules staff and certified staff. So senior managers need to understand the new regime. They need to be able to understand how the law is going to apply to them, understand that they have greater liability, etc. Certification employees need to understand changes to their status, how they're falling off the register, etc. And all of them need to or both of those need to understand how the conduct rules are going to apply to their role. And conduct rules staff need to understand the conduct rules and, again, how they apply to their role. The training required under PISMA is that it's suitable, and then when we look in the Complyport, I think it is, the requirements there are that everyone has a broad understanding of, well, this is to do directly with conduct rules, but everyone has a broad understanding of the conduct rules and how they apply to them, and then a deeper understanding of specific rules which are relevant to an individual's work. And we're tending to look at this on the level of, if you are in sales, the integrity rule requires that you don't lie to clients. There isn't additional guidance to this, and obviously a smaller firm might have potentially be trying to come up with quite a lot of examples for how each individual unit is actually trained, and that is probably creating more work. And the other thing about this training that's very important is that there's a senior management function that training is properly done under this regime. So from day one, you're training, whoever you're training, senior manager, is accountable for the fact that this training has been done properly. The other thing that training should probably include is the idea of non-financial misconduct. So those are things like the trader who every day came in from Kent on the train and then just tapped his oyster out was that's a dishonesty offence, and that's integrity, and that's non-financial misconduct. The other example the FCA uses any sort of internal bullying or anything like that. So it's really thinking about all of those additional areas in the context of these rules. Okay. So moving on to post the implementation date and things to think about there. New senior manager side, I've already talked a little bit about the Form A, and we're going to look. The only thing to point out that I wanted to point out straight off the bat here was that any NDAs drafted can't frustrate regulatory references. The FCA are quite clear on that. But David, I think you want to talk about a records check.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. So this is one of the issues that has created a few difficulties. At the moment, the FCA does criminal records checks to understand its policies, to do it on a kind of spot check basis. It doesn't do it for every approved person that's been put forward for approval. What's going to happen under the senior managers and certification regime, though, is that the onus goes to the firms. So the first thing is that there's a separate treatment of senior managers from certification staff. Senior managers, the firm is obliged to, and it must get a standard disclosure check. And that means a standard DBS disclosure check would disclose an individual's spent and unspent convictions. The FCA wants firms to do that because it's part of testing whether the person's fit and proper. For certification staff, there's no legal, it's technically unlawful for an employer to seek disclosure of spent convictions in relation to certification staff. So what does that all mean? Well, that means that in practice, employers have a choice as to what they do. They either don't do criminal records checks for certification staff, or they do basic checks which only disclose unspent convictions. But unspent convictions would be things that have happened very recently, and they tend to be, and that's not particularly good. To give you an example, if you were taking on someone who's currently would hold a CS30 role and will be a certification staff under the new regime, and they had committed a fraud maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, that's probably not going to be caught because it will be a spent conviction, and therefore it wouldn't be caught by a basic disclosure check. And obviously, our conviction for fraud, I would suggest, does rather go to the issue of whether someone is honest and has integrity and is fit and proper. So as you can see, that's an issue. Firms have to make the decision: do they get the basic checks or do they not? Do they do it on a blanket basis? Do they do it, or just when there's a reason to do so? And there's also a GDPR element to that as well. I'm not a data privacy lawyer, but I work with my data privacy colleagues to help draft the documentation that's needed if the client decides that they are going to do basic checks for certification staff. So definitely something that you have to think about, criminal records checks, because it is a requirement for the senior managers. Using an intermediary would be my advice, because that's what everybody else is doing. They're getting an intermediary involved to take on the burden of doing this. It's not particularly expensive. There are lots of providers in the market. They're very well versed now in what they're going to have to do under the senior manager's regime. Just make sure that your documentation with the provider protects you from a data privacy point of view. The one tricky area I would say that is going to come up is when you have to get criminal records checks from a foreign jurisdiction. So that's when you've got an individual who's worked in the past or lived in the past somewhere other than the UK, and you then somehow have to work out how on earth do you do a criminal records check for someone that is going to be a senior manager. Obviously, it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis, but that is going to be one of those tricky issues that firms are going to have to work around as and when it arises. Regulatory references, so yeah, there's a template form. Have your procedure, I would suggest, to make it very easy for HR or compliance, whoever's going to pick up, to know what they have to do. Just be aware that regulatory references are going to have an impact on the timing of recruitment, because there is going to have to be a period where you go out and try and get the regulatory references for the past 6 years of someone's employment history, and then you have to wait for the responses. A difficulty here, of course, is when you're dealing with firms that are outside the financial services sector that have no obligation whatsoever to respond to you, is then what steps do you need to go to try and get some sort of confirmation that the individual was employed by that entity, and that indeed that there's nothing to suggest that they're not fit and proper. I would suggest two approaches here. One is Google and LinkedIn to try and establish that the candidate actually did. There's some evidence that they did actually work there. So, you know, if there's some evidence that on Google that the individual you're trying to recruit had worked for the former employer, because the former employer's made some sort of statement about them, then that'll help show the FCA that you've actually tried to work out their work history. It's a tricky thing though as to how far you have to go to try and discharge to the FCA to show that you have taken reasonable steps to work out the person's work history and that they're fit and proper. And I think individuals are having to deal with this on a kind of, our firms will have to deal with this as and when the issues arise. But I would suggest it's probably not sufficient to say, well, we asked for a reference once and didn't get a response, so we just left it. I think there has to be steps over and above that to try and get non-financial services former employers to give you some information about the employee or the candidate. Again, I would suggest that intermediaries are a good way to go about doing this. very common approach in the market. It's what the big banks do. The one thing I just would say is if you are asking an intermediary to go out to get regulatory reference information about a candidate that you want to employ, please do say to the intermediary that they have to pass on as much information about the role that the candidate's going to be employed into as they can, because I see this, I would say, 4 times out of 5. If something contentious happens with regulatory references, it comes across my desk as an employment lawyer, I do notice that the intermediaries aren't necessarily saying this individual's applying for a role as, I don't know, an algorithmic trader, the role will involve X, Y, and Z. That information needs to be given so that the former employer who's in the financial services sector can give the responses that are needed in the template, so that they can say to the potential future employer, here is my view on the things that might affect this person's fitness and propriety. So just make sure that your intermediaries, the message here is make sure your intermediaries are given full and good information to any entities that they're requesting a reference from, so that that entity can give a full and complete reference, and that they won't then come back and say we don't have enough information, and then that delays the process.
Great, thank you.
Yes. The other thing I think it's worth pointing out at this point, because we're talking about new SMF hires, actually is certification staff, very briefly, because I realise we don't actually have a slide on it. So we're finding that CF30s are moving across the certification staff, and we haven't yet found an argument for them not to. A couple of clients have tried, but we haven't had any successful. Actually, if you were a CF30, you don't need to be certification. The other thing about the certification staff is identifying them is actually could be a bit more of an issue than it first appears, because there are 3 or 4 different types of certification staff. Well, I think there's 6, but rarely see a couple of them. So identification of certification staff is actually something that firms need to be as on top of as the identification of senior managers, which I don't think is quite coming through as much as it should do with a lot of people at the moment. Yeah, the final question on all of this is, where does this actually sit again in the business? Again, I think this slightly depends who's driving this project. If the project is driven by HR, it will tend to sit in HR, but if it's driven by compliance, it will tend to sit in compliance. Again, slightly depends on the relationship. Okay, so termination. When individuals leave the firm, obviously, if they are remaining in the financial services industry, you will expect to get a regulatory reference. And regulatory references could come in at any point from December 2019, and then they could come in until December 2020, and they will almost certainly happen after December 2020. So firms need to be making sure that their process for termination and keeping the records are up to date, implemented. They're keeping those records for 6 years or longer if required, and then they are being appropriately got rid of. There's a slightly weird quirk in the new regime where firms only need to update references if the individual they gave a reference for is still at the new firm. So if someone leaves your firm and goes to join firm A, and once they leave, as we know, or as you tend to know, once they leave, if an investigation happens and you find out something about that individual that you would have put in your regulatory reference, you then are under a requirement to update firm A of that change. But if the individual has already left firm A by the time that information comes out, you no longer need to update firm A. But how do you know the individual's left firm A, for the first point? And B, that seems to be a lot of hoops to jump through to make sure that your complying with the rules. So actually, we're saying that generally, I think you are in a better position if you, if you're about to update a reference, you just need to check with the firm that the individual is still there. We did initially, it did look like the references would actually push through all of the firms, but that's not actually the way the system is going to work, which does seem to create a small regulatory reference hole. I think this might be your comment actually. Firms' references should be drafted at termination and provided to the individual for comment. So
yeah, this is just a suggestion in terms of practice, is that I think it makes sense for two reasons when an employee is departing to draft a regulatory reference there and then. The first one is it gives the opportunity for the employee to comment on anything adverse in the reference, which is what the FCA recommends, and it also means that it'll flush out whether the employee is going to take issue with anything in the reference. I would suggest, my experience is, if a reference is anything less than unblemished, they will take issue, but perhaps it's better to flush it out then while you still have some sort of relationship with them, and to bring it to a head rather than 3-4 months or many years down the line when the reference is issued. But another thing, just a more practical point, is that if a reference is drafted at the point when an employee leaves their employment, then that reference can be put away in the personnel file and retained until it's needed. And what you don't have is a situation where 5 years down the line you get a regulatory reference request and some poor compliance or HR administrator has to go and find the files and try and reconstruct the detail of the reference.
And I think there might also be a potential issue that we've yet to fully flesh out on timing of actually requesting a regulatory reference. Because if someone hasn't yet given notice and you're requesting a reference, obviously that's not necessarily good for the individual, but until you have that regulatory reference, you can't guarantee that they are going to be considered a certified individual. So there is a potential issue there.
There are exceptions in the rules with regards to the timing of requesting regulatory references, and it depends on various things which probably won't go into here. And it is something you probably want to look into and take advice depending on the circumstances. But yes, as I said, just in general, assume that regulatory references are going to create an increased timeline at the outset of trying to recruit someone.
So moving on to the new Gabriel return, which firms will be delighted about. The FCA is actually hoping to update Gabriel, so that would be good. So Rep 008, so this relates to conduct rule breaches. So if a senior manager breaches a conduct rule, you have 7 business days to report it to the FCA. Again, that's quite why they chose 7 days is a slight mystery, but it's this is from the point. So when we say breach a conduct rule here, we don't mean that the rule is breached on day 1 and you start investigating it and you have to have it all done by day 7. This is 7 days from the day you basically are confident and happy that you know what has happened and what the breach was. So yeah, it doesn't quite allow you to drag your heels and wait, never produce a report. So it's the point at which you're comfortable that you need to make this return, basically. Certified employee breaches are slightly different, and certified and conduct employee breaches. So they, once a year, when the Rep 008 is required, which I think is 2 months after the day after your year end, firms are required to tell the FCA of any breaches that have happened by certified employees. The procedure needs to be in place to make sure that those records are retained and it's easy to access. So it looks from some of the FCA rules that the 12-month period they're discussing in the Rep 008 will actually be the 12-month period ending on the last day of August, just to throw an extra layer into the works. So it's up to firms to keep pretty good records, because you could actually be holding on to these breaches for quite a long time before you report them. Open investigations don't need to be reported. And again, there's another little gap here that's been created. So if an individual leaves the firm during this renewal process and the process can't be completed, the firm doesn't submit a report to the FCA, although it could still potentially go on a regulatory reference, although might need to discuss that with some employment advice. And the Rep 08 can be a nil return, which is useful. But firms, again, are responsible for making sure that the Rep 008 appears in their Gabriel returns. As with all of these things, the FCA might do it with their system and create it, but they keep firms responsible for it being correct. The directory. This has been potentially missed by a few firms. I think it's beginning to filter through, but because it was it's a second policy statement by the FCA, an afterthought, or at least an argument that was going on when the first policy statement was created. Not all firms picked up on the new directory. So it relates to all certified employees, and it needs to be populated by December 2020, so there's that year gap. But that year gap gives you an opportunity to work out exactly who should go on, work out to do all the work that is needed before you can put people onto the directory. There's also going to be a new annual confirmation of accuracy that will be required. So the clock on the confirmation actually starts from the last day you change something on the directory, but rather than keeping a record of that, so this ever-moving deadline of when you'd need to confirm the directory is up to date, we'd actually recommend that firms set a date on which they confirm the directory is up to date. So you might like to do it every April. You go, right, let's make sure we confirm the directory, because it just takes away that layer of calendar planning, which just creates an extra confusion. So you can just set your date, and then you'll know that you've always done your annual compilation, even if nothing has changed on the directory. Okay. Coming on to the annual review process for certified employees. So again, the first certified employees review will need to take place before 2020, in which you're certified fitness and propriety. Ideally, this process can just be built into an existing employee review process. This wouldn't necessarily be the case, particularly for smaller firms. They might find that actually their review process is less formalised than this requires. And the other issue that this really throws up is that because a certification can only be valid for 12 months, maximum of 12 months, you may find you actually need to have an 11-month process to give you enough time to do the bits and certify, and if something comes back and isn't quite right, or if people are away, or if something happens that makes that certification difficult. If you're running a 12-month process, you could potentially miss certifying someone, and that isn't something you want to be doing in this regime. I think David is going to talk about managers training.
Yeah, just very quickly, one of the kind of practical questions that came up when we've been rolling the documentation out for this is it's a good idea to make sure that the managers who will be doing the annual reviews know what they're looking for. The forms can only be so helpful because, of course, when you're actually making an assessment about an individual's capability or competency to do their specific role, you might want to think about giving the managers some training or a bit more guidance as to how they go about assessing that annually. Self-attestation, this has been the typical way that the banks and now most of the senior manager, most clients that we're speaking to are going to deal with individuals on an annual basis to get them to self-attest that they've not done anything during the year which up until then which would affect their fitness and propriety. This is particularly to tease out where they've actually done something criminal or wrong, or something that would affect their honesty, integrity or reputation. And that is just the kind of way in practice that firms are going about showing that they've tried to discharge their obligation to check that individuals are fit and proper.
And then finally, post-implementation review. We said this at the top, but we'll remind everyone that the SCA have been clear that there isn't room for error in the way the regime is implemented. So we think the SCA will expect firms to be implemented, expect firms to be ready, and expect firms to make decisions that are the right decisions from the FCA's perspective. Potentially, I always think from a regulatory perspective, if you're making a decision that is borderline or you're not 100% sure about it, obviously, firstly, I would talk to a compliance consultancy. But secondly, what I would do is I would write down, make sure to make a really clear note of what you've done and why you've done it. Because it is always a stronger position to be in with the regulator, saying this is what I did and why I did it, than absolutely no information about why something happened. But there is still time to make sure that this regime is implemented correctly. If you are in any of the earlier phases, then I would suggest that you really push your focus to it and get as many people, get as much work done on it as you can, so you can actually meet that all-important deadline.
Great. David, Robert, thank you for presenting today. Before we start looking at your questions, I'd like to let everyone who signed up to listen to today's webinar know that Complyport has some free SMCR goodies to give away. We have a SMCR project plan as well as a one-pager for compliance staff to customize and inform the rest of their organizations about upcoming changes to the firm. If you would like copies of these, can you please email me at jonathan.greenstein@complyport.co.uk. That's JONATHAN.green, like the color, STEIN @complyport.co.uk. I'll also be posting my email address in the chat function for everyone to copy and paste if they want it. And now on to the questions. We've had a few submitted here. So first question, our firm has no employees consisting of 3 directors and 1 SF30 for specific function who is also registered with another much larger firm. How can we comply in regards to annual reviews? CF30.
I think, yeah, CF30 is completely so in terms of complying with regard to annual reviews, the individual will need to be so let's talk about the CF30 first, because the idea that so the CF30 would need to be reviewed by both firms because the SM&CR exists on an entity level. So as a regulated firm, if they're carrying out a certification function, you would expect that they are reviewed on a yearly level because that's the requirement. So just because they are also employed by another firm, unless that firm is also in your group, you can. If the firm is in the same group as you can, as long as you've got access to all the information, then that would be sufficient. But if they are not in the same group as you, then you need to make sure that you're doing that work.
Great. We have 2 questions here relating to conduct staff. First question is, are companies making operations staff into conduct staff? And the second one is, are smaller firms making office managers into conduct staff?
I think the answer to both is yes. So there are specific ancillary staff which the FCA has set out There's quite a specific list of them. The general rule is if they are doing anything that exists, anything that makes the financial services activity happen, then they are conduct staff. The examples are receptionists, cleaners, things like that. So, and I think when we say receptionist there, we would mean if you're in a big building and you have receptionists down the bottom who literally sign people in and out, not the smaller firm receptionist who probably helps compliance do bits and pieces. So, as with so much of this regime, it comes down to what the individuals are actually doing, but it is likely that both of those individuals would be conduct staff. Yeah. The other example we've had before is interns, who would probably who we think would be conduct staff on the basis that they would have access to the information that you'd expect an individual working in financial services to have. So even an intern would be conduct staff while they were there.
Great. Another question, we've got quite a few to get through here very quickly if we can. We have an existing cert function employee. Do we need to go back to do retrospective reg references and CBS?
They've got an existing certification function employee.
Do you need to go back to do retrospective regulatory references and CBS?
So no, the regulatory references apply at the point of recruitment. As regards criminal records checks, I would suggest no. This isn't a black or white answer. If the person's already employed, you've got no reason to suspect that they've got criminal records and that they otherwise seem fit and proper, then I would suggest that you probably don't have valid grounds to be doing a criminal records check. That's the way I would approach it.
Okay.
I think the other thing to think about is there is the internal hire. If you're doing an intra-group hire, the rules can be slightly different, but not in that case.
Yeah, for regular.
What is meant by an internal investigation? An open investigation? I mentioned open investigations before, and that they do not need to be.
So if you were looking into some conduct of an employee, but you hadn't made a decision on the conduct, so you either didn't yet have evidence, or the evidence wasn't available for some reason.
Okay. Redocumentation, the FCA is mentioning templates of new docs required, i.e. SORS, if impossible to find on the website so far. Any advice?
Well, we have them available. The FCA is expecting most of these things to be written internally by firms. They do technically have a SOR on their website. It's just almost impenetrable. So what we've actually done is taken it out of the format the FCA requested, and we turned it into a Word document that people can actually use. And then when you go to fill out, it's laborious, which is irritating. But then when you go to fill out a SOR on the website, which you do need to do on occasion, everything is a click and paste away rather than having to draft the whole thing.
Next question. How does the new regime apply to appointed reps? For instance, a CF1 AR function, for instance, is that a SMF in the new regime?
No, appointed reps are not in the new regime. So okay. They remain in the current regime.
Okay. Do we need to submit Form Cs for existing CF30s that will not take on SMFs? If so, when should this be done?
No, don't need
to. We are a three-man firm. We do not have a chairperson on NED. So do we need to do a Form K?
No.
Okay.
Definitely.
Will appointed representatives ever be brought into this regime?
I wouldn't be able to say ever. I don't know. I'm not the FCA.
Okay. How do we get references from firms outside the regulated arena for staff? Will they know that NDAs shouldn't apply?
No, the short answer to this is they won't know that. Well, they'll be bound by their non-disclosure agreements, they've got no, if they're outside the financial services regime, which I think was the question, then they won't be bound by any obligation not to tie their hands in terms of what they can say in any reference. In fact, quite the opposite. If there's been a contentious exit, they'll probably have agreed exactly what they can say in terms of a reference. As I mentioned, getting information out of non-regulated employers outside of the financial service space is going to be difficult, and quite often you will just not get a response from the employer, and you've got no way really to compel them to help you.
Great. Can we repeat why a standard DBS check can't be carried out on non-SMF certified individuals?
There's no exemption in the law for it. Generally speaking, to get criminal records data about individuals, it has to fall within there's a quite long-winded exemption order. The way it's constructed, senior managers will fall under that exemption order, but certification staff will not. This is something that arose when the banks had to implement SMCR. It's something that they raised with the government, but it's not changed.
And interestingly, the FCA specifically discussed it and say that firms should seriously consider it. So
yeah, but you can't, and I don't want to go into the ins and outs of it, but it's a technical breach of the law to seek disclosure of spent convictions for anyone other than senior managers.
If you need to submit a Form A for an executive director to also be a chair, when does this need to be submitted by, and what happens if the FCA doesn't approve them in the additional role by the 9th of December?
You would need to submit it before the 9th of December. If the FCA are still processing it, not quite sure. I think there was an exemption for processing it, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. So I'm not sure. Which is partly why we would suggest people get those forms in as quickly as possible.
Okay. Will the principal or the AR be responsible for providing regulatory references in the future? Staff can leave the principal AR pair by the AR moving firms without termination taking place.
Well, if you were an AR, you wouldn't be under the regime. So.
Okay. Will regulatory references need to be provided for employees that left prior to December 2019? No? Okay.
You might know the answer. I'm not 100% certain on what the answer is to that. I set out in the rules. I genuinely just don't know off the top of my head what the answer is.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure.
In relation to the directory, do we know if there's a specific format for it yet?
There will be specific questions. We don't know what the format will actually look like, but it's all the things you would expect on the front page of the Form A, effectively, that you tell the FCA, so name, passports, national insurance number, etc. So there will be quite specific questions to firms.
Okay. Will an annual self-attestation be sufficient, or do we need to do a new criminal check each year?
I wouldn't suggest you need to do a criminal records check each year. I think some firms are toying with the idea of maybe doing it once every 3 years, and I know that some employers are interested in the idea of if something arises which makes them suspicious that an individual has not disclosed to them that they have an unspent conviction, that they would then try to get them to request a criminal records check, but there are employment issues and risks that go along with that. So I think sorry, I've got the question in front of me again.
Sorry, let's screw it up there. There you go.
Yeah. So I wouldn't suggest that you would need to be going and getting new criminal records checks each year in the normal course. I would just say though, don't. I think the FCA would be critical if you relied on self-attestation of itself without doing at least some sort of thinking around it or some sort of corroboration. especially if you had concerns about an individual.
Okay, brilliant. We already do fitness and propriety questionnaire annually, along with annual credit checks. There are only 3 advisors at the firm, so surely SMCR is not asking us to do more than we already do, are they?
The fitness and propriety questionnaire is good. The only issue is obviously it is, I think as David is saying, it's the firm's responsibility that fitness and propriety is accurate, and just doing a almost self attesting entirely doesn't work. There are questions that I might want to ask that are slightly more. So again, I think as I was saying earlier, we may well just slightly enhance what you're doing, but it sounds like you're going in the right sort of direction.
Okay. I'm conscious that we've hit our time limit. If everyone's okay to stay on a little bit longer, we can try to get the rest of these questions sorted. We've got a few left to get through here. For a small firm with only 1 director as a responsible individual, how does the new SM&CR impact?
It's a firm with 1 director, so that director would no doubt go across to be a senior manager. If they have a compliance officer, I'm assuming they have a compliance officer. It depends if they're the same person. Yeah, the impact could be quite big on that individual. You might need to consider the amount of challenge that's actually going on at board level anyway. The FCA aren't wildly keen on firms with 1 director and no challenge, so it might be something to have a think about. But essentially, rules would apply to that director if they would to anyone else.
Okay. Can you be more specific regarding updating documentation? What needs to be included in docs such as manuals and contracts of employment?
So there's a reg piece to this, and then there's a regulatory piece to this, and then there's an employment. Do you want to comment?
Should I do the? So in the manual, we'd expect it would slightly depend what style manual you have. Most of the manuals we see would describe what the current approved persons regime is and does and who it applies to, and you need to update your manual to make sure that your section on APA becomes a section on the SM&CR.
Mm-hmm.
You'd also need to make sure that wherever you mention a control function, you update that appropriately as part of your annual update to your manual. We tend to find that firms have this year, they've just held off. If they had a summer update to the manual, we're just holding off for a couple of months so that we can update the manual in time for the December changeover, so you get 1 change rather than 2 changes to the manual.
As regards employment contracts, these are the things I would suggest that are the desirable terms. An obligation that the employee will give an honest self-attestation when employed and annually, that they will cooperate and assist, so you can have this in the offer letter or in the employment contract if it's issued before they're taken on, that they'll cooperate with the onboarding process, that they'll help you get regulatory references or just normal employers' references, that they will be responsible for updating their statement of responsibility periodically as and when there's changes to it, or when they think there are changes to it, that they will come and discuss it with the board, and that they will do an adequate, full, complete handover of their responsibilities before they depart, that they will comply with the code of conduct, and to the extent that the code of conduct that they're called by the senior managers code of conduct as well, that they will comply with that they will report any breaches of the code of conduct to the board promptly, that they will report the breaches of others, breaches of the code of conduct rules to the board, that they will that they will report anything that affects their fitness and propriety as and when it arises. I would add to the list of allegations, the things that could form gross misconduct entitling an employer to summarily dismiss. I would add breaches of the conduct rules, failing to be fit and proper, and that's, I mean, there are lots of other little things, but I think those are the main things that I would say are very desirable to have an employment contract.
Great. Thank you very much. We are a mortgage advice company consisting of 2 directors and 20 self-employed mortgage advisors. Do we need to do fresh checks on all our self-employed sales staff?
Assuming those self-employed sales staff are CS30, then I would assume not, but slightly depends on the situation, I suspect.
Okay. What training would non-advising admin staff need?
Conduct rules training, so they need to understand the key, the integrity and everyone else is the be nice rules.
A question has come in. Our understanding is that approved representatives are out of scope at SMCR, and the approved persons regime will still apply to the individuals at them. This is correct?
Point of representative.
Yes. We work in a service office with a receptionist also working for other companies. How would conduct rules apply to them, and when we are not responsible for their employment?
It wouldn't unless they also came in and did work for you that was related to your financial services.
Okay. We are looking into rationalising the number of CF30s we have ahead of the regime. Current CF30s perform research for an investment committee only, no direct advisory function performed. If the dealing in or arrangement of investments with clients is provided by committee consensus, would the researchers be considered to be client dealing functions?
If they are the people giving out those investment decisions, then yes.
Okay. If a certified employee is dismissed for gross misconduct, which also relates to the conduct rules, must that be reported on the annual Rep 008?
Yes, usually so.
Yeah.
Okay. For sole director limited company firms with no other employees other than the statement of responsibilities, what other steps would you suggest to take before the deadline?
Sole director
Limited company firms.
limited firms scope.
Yeah.
Not very limited. So
limited. LTD.
Oh no, sorry. I thought you meant limited. Well, I think you'd still need to make sure that you'd worked out who your certification employees were, and you'd updated your policies, and that you'd made sure that everything would transfer across as it should be. So, in fact, being a smaller firm doesn't, unfortunately, take away many of the requirements of the regime.
We've really hit our time now. We've got quite a few more questions. What we'll do is try answer the questions by email, if not today, then tomorrow. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in today's webinar, and that now concludes today's webinar. Many thanks to David at Fieldfisher and Robert at Complyport, and all of you for attending today. One final time, if you want the free SMCR giveaways, then please email jonathan.greenstein@complyport.co.uk. Thank you very much for attending, and have a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.